The story you are about to hear is quiet by design. It is not a parade of sirens or a gallery of legends. It is a slow walk through rooms where the air smells of coffee and old wool, where men who once trusted noise began to trust schedules. We will start in New York when the nights were longer than they needed to be, when one proud decision could tilt a city, and when a few careful minds asked a simple question. What if power sat at a table instead of on a throne? What if arguments ended with a nod instead of a gunshot in the dark? From that plain idea came a council with no sign on the door, a habit of meetings that tried to turn fury into agenda items, and a trail of calm words that patient listeners would one day stitch into a case. Settle in. The minutes are about to begin. If you like this story, feel free to like and subscribe. A comment below with your location and time is also welcome, as it's always a good motivation to keep going when I see how far the stories are reaching. Chapter 1. From Boss of All Bosses to Committee with Coffee. New York City in the early 1930s carried a deep and quiet fatigue that clung to the bricks like soot. The streets still bustled, but the movement had a strained edge, as if everyone had spent too many nights listening for the sound of something going wrong. Delivery trucks rattled over worn cobblestones, elevated trains screamed past windows, in tenement kitchens mothers stirred pots and pretended not to notice when certain names were spoken in careful half-syllables. The Castellammarese War was over, at least on paper, but the memory of its noise lived on in the way people glanced toward doorways when cars slowed down outside. Ordinary workers did not follow every headline, but they understood a pattern. When powerful men fought, funerals multiplied, and the rest of the city walked home a little faster. For the men who had survived at the top, the exhaustion was sharper. They had watched associates fall one after another over questions that were, in the end, about pride dressed up as principle. They had paid for stubborn gestures with money and lives. The old model that promised certainty through a single ruler had revealed itself as a trick. A boss of all bosses was less a shield than a target painted in bright colours. Every ambitious captain thought he could tear that target down and replace it. Every policeman and every reporter loved the simplicity of that story, one villain to chase, one throne to top. It made them feel effective, and it made the men in charge easier to point at. For those who hoped to stay breathing past middle age, the conclusion was unavoidable. The structure itself was the problem. Charles Lucky Luciano walked through that tired moment with a calm that did not match the city's frayed nerves. He moved like someone who had already decided what had to change, and was now quietly lining up all the pieces. Luciano did not waste many words on speeches. He preferred soft suggestions, gentle repetition, and the steady pressure of results. At his side, in different rooms and different hours, were men who understood calculation. Meyer Lansky with his patient numbers and distrust of useless drama, Frank Costello with his comfortable ties to legitimate faces, the man who could talk to politicians and businessmen and make both groups believe they were the ones being generous. Together they formed a kind of quiet committee before the commission had a name, asking the same basic question again and again. What if the throne idea was retired? What if the future belonged not to one crowned figure, but to a circle? The more they turned it over, the more sensible it became. A circle of recognized bosses could cool down disputes before they exploded. Each man would keep his own family and territory, but agree to respect the boundaries of others. No major move, no unaliving of a boss, no seismic change in alliances would happen without a sit-down. The strongest men would share responsibility for stability, instead of trying to prove greatness through constant brinksmanship. It did not make them kind, it made them conservative in the purest sense, guarding what they had. They no longer had the luxury of romance. They had learned that romantic ideas end with black cars and early graves. Convincing other required patience. Some of the older generation heard this talk of councils and suspected a trick. They had grown up on stories of absolute power. To them, consulting peers sounded suspiciously like giving something away. Luciano answered them with arithmetic. He pointed to profits lost during the years of war, to judges suddenly interested in making examples, to police commanders who like their careers tied to chasing a single well-publicized villain. He reminded them how many promising men had been buried for no better reason than when leaders' vanity. When you showed them the costs in steady columns, even the proudest skeptic had to admit that the numbers did not flatter the old style. Away from the street gossip, in hotel suites and apartments where curtains met at the center with no gaps, these arguments settled slowly into agreement. No documents, no signatures, only shared advantage. A commission would acknowledge the major families of New York as equals in council, welcome Chicago as a central voice, and extend careful recognition to powerful allies in other regions. The council would not manage every detail. It would intervene when a decision threatened to pull everyone into a public mess. It would guarantee that to strike at a boss or to redraw boundaries, you needed more than Atzmann's anger. The step from theory to practice was small, and it came almost naturally to men who were tired of paying for other people's theatre. In the early days of this experiment, there were moments of dry humor that made the whole thing feel less like revolution and more like reluctant maturity. Hardened figures would joke that they were turning into a board of directors of things no one could put on a letterhead. Someone would mutter that next they would be handing out paper agendas. Another would complain, in a tone that was not entirely sarcastic, that sitting in meetings was more tiring than settling things the old way. The laughter in those rooms was brief and controlled, but valuable. It let proud men accept that age and experience had forced them to admit a simple truth ordinary shopkeepers already knew. Talking first is cheaper. Soon enough, without banners or announcements, the commission existed. It had no office and no sign on a door. It was a habit shared by a handful of men whose names made others straighten up when spoken. They tested its strength through small situations, a push across a neighborhood line, a dispute over a bookmaker who had shifted loyalties. Instead of turning those sparks into bonfires, the bosses summoned the right people, heard the facts, and imposed a result that protected business. Sometimes that meant ordering restraint on both sides. Sometimes it meant a quiet, targeted consequence. Either way, the outcome followed a conversation instead of a whim. The point was never mercy. The point was control. On certain nights, if an invisible observer could have slipped into those rooms, he would have seen something unexpectedly ordinary. Men in good suits sitting around a table drinking coffee gone lukewarm, listening more than they spoke. Concerns laid out like items on a list. Numbers murmured. Names mentioned briefly, then weighed in silence. Decisions phrased in language so simple that it stripped away any glamour. Take care of this. Fix that. Make sure he understands. A far cry from the feverish legends told later, but far more effective. What kept the system together was not friendship, but the knowledge that crossing a collective decision meant calling down the weight of all those quiet voices at once. The effect washed outward in gradual waves. Fewer spectacular clashes among the top ranks, fewer wild gambles that ignored the reaction of neighboring families. The lower levels still saw sudden storms, but above them, something like a clock began to tick. Men checked in with their betters before swinging at problems that might echo. Even those who disliked the new discipline had to respect it. If they refused and moved alone, they risked learning that the commission knew how to correct its own. The choice was simple: talk at a table with coffee, or face the combined displeasure of men who preferred not to be embarrassed. Luciano, before events eventually pushed him out of the country, had reason to think that his quiet plan had worked. He had not created peace, and he had not tried. He had replaced a single fragile crown with a structure that could absorb shock. When Nenman fell, another could take his seat without the whole system shattering. From the outside, nothing official could be seen. From the inside, it was clear that a kind of constitution existed, unwritten but enforced. For all its darkness, this structure carried a cool, unsettling logic. If you must live in a brutal trade, it whispered, at least keep minutes, at least pretend to be adults, at least argue before you destroy. Chapter 2. The First Gathering. Outside, the city went on with its usual noise: streetcars, cabs, radio music leaking from open windows. Inside a certain midtown hotel, the air felt padded and careful. Curtains drawn, carpets thick enough to swallow footsteps. A long polished table stretched across the room, the kind usually reserved for senior partners and company boards. One by one, men arrived who did not appear on any public directory, except as rumors. They moved with quiet assurance, carrying years of reputation in the uncomplicated drape of their coats. There were eyes planted downstairs, in the lobby, at the curb, across the street, men reading newspapers too slowly. A car that did not leave when the rain started. All the normal precautions. But upstairs, as the chairs filled, the atmosphere had an odd calm. Old grudges slipped into the background. Personal slights and remembered snubs were folded and tucked away. None of them wanted to go back to the chaos they had just survived. The room felt like neutral ground, carved out of habit and necessity. Luciano took his place without ceremony. His presence was an anchor more than a display. Beside and behind him, Meyer Lansky watched and listened, eyes catching every hesitation, every sidelong glance. Frank Costello arrived with his usual smooth warmth, the practiced ease of someone who knew how to put both judges and dock workers at ease. From Chicago came trusted representatives, carrying the weight of their city with a few quiet nods. From other regions came men whose names mattered enough to be included, but not enough to overshadow the table. Looking at them, you might have thought they were simply influential businessmen trying to stay off the gossip pages. That impression would not have been entirely wrong. What began then was less a ceremony and more a slow test of an idea. Luciano spoke briefly of stability, of avoiding past mistakes. No long speeches, just a firm recognition of who sat where, who led which family, who held which city. New York families, Chicago, key regions elsewhere, each name spoken with enough respect to keep the room level. The message was that everyone seated here had something to lose if the old habits returned. They were, in effect, founding members of a board with a very narrow membership list. They moved carefully into the question of territory. Invisible borders laid across boroughs and states, lines you could not find on any city map. The point was not to rewrite the world, but to acknowledge realities and prevent the kind of surprise incursions that had once led to blood in the gutters and raids on businesses. A family operating in another family's area without agreement would no longer be seen as bold, only as reckless. The Commission, as they began to think of it, could call such behavior to account. The threat did not need to be shouted. Everyone in that room knew what collective disapproval could mean. Dry remarks floated whenever the details grew too fine. Someone observed that they sounded like a trade association arguing over shipping lanes. Another muttered that pretty soon they would hire clerks. There was a strained little laugh, and with it some of the tension slipped away. The humour worked because it admitted the strangeness of what they were doing. Men known for decisive, often harsh moves were volunteering to be bound by discussion. The joke was that they were pretending to be executives. The truth was that executives had simply discovered a more reliable way to protect themselves, and these men were catching up. Then came the quiet building of rules. Not written, never recorded, agreed upon in low voices and held in memory. No leader at this table was to be unalived without the approval of the others. Serious disputes were to be brought before the Commission before anyone reached for permanent solutions. Large ventures crossing regions were to be discussed, so that no one found unexpected competition settled on their doorstep. These were simple statements, but in this room they were radical. They turned private impulses into matters of shared concern. Some of the older bosses shifted in their seats at that. They had grown used to a world in which their word was final and immediate. To ask permission before striking at another man of their rank sounded against nature. But Costello, with his gentle voice, spoke about influence, about the way respectable partners preferred predictability. A united, orderly leadership scared law enforcement in one way, but reassured business contacts in another. The Commission could offer quiet guarantees that fights would be limited, agreements honoured. Stability meant steady income meant fewer reasons for attention. Even the most stubborn men at the table understood that arithmetic. Imagine a silent observer in the corner, perhaps a waiter trained to see nothing. He would watch as these men, rumoured monsters in certain neighbourhoods, debated like tired administrators who had finally seen too many disaster reports. The talk, stripped of context, would sound like any boardroom. We should avoid problems that bring heat. We should talk before we act. We should make sure surprises do not repeat. Not noble words, but rational ones. The observer might sense that these men were not becoming kind. They were becoming careful. In their world, that counted as an evolution. When the meeting drew to a close, the room did not erupt into backslaps or sentimental declarations. It ended with quiet nods, a few handshakes, some colder than others. Travel plans were confirmed, exit routes arranged so the lobby would never see a grand parade. One by air, they stepped back into elevators, into hallways, into cars waiting with engines running. The hotel staff would remember nothing more troubling than a private function with serious-looking guests. But the world that waited outside was no longer quite the same. There was now a thread linking those who had been in that room. They had accepted that from here on, certain decisions would not belong to one man alone. There would be sit-downs before storms. There would be calls before escalations. A captain in some distant borough, testing his luck, would soon learn about this new arrangement when his enthusiasm needed explaining. In time, the story would spread through careful whispers. There is a table. The table does not like surprises. The law had not yet caught up to this reality. Investigators still chased the simple fantasy of supreme figure. Reports passed across desks describing individuals, not councils. Those tasked with building cases did not yet understand that the most important thing in that world had become the least visible thing of all, a habit of meeting. It would take years and many small signs before they understood that cooperation at the top was not a myth. For now, the Commission breathed in the blind spots. In the nights that followed, that first gathering showed its quiet influence. A minor territorial slip that might once have ended with someone lying in the street now resulted in a request for a sit-down. Two senior men met, spoke calmly, and adjusted shares. A young associate who had acted without permission was disciplined, but not erased. The correction carried a new kind of warning. You answer not only to your boss, but to the expectations of a wider circle. You do not embarrass your people before the Commission. Across the country, others watched and imitated. Local leaders, hearing how the big table worked, tried their own versions. Inner councils, advisory groups, more formal sit-downs. The habits of consultation moved outward. Imperfect, stubborn, often bent by ego, but still a movement in the same direction. The life was never going to be gentle, yet it was, piece by piece, becoming more organized. In that order, some found comfort. In that order, others saw the shape of a future problem, because the more structured a system becomes, the more clearly it can be targeted. For now, though, the Commission remained a sort of quiet secret, an agreement among men who had seen enough unmarked graves to appreciate the usefulness of a meeting agenda, even if no one dared call it that. For listeners settling down to sleep, it is almost an odd comfort to consider. In the dim back rooms of that era, some of the most feared figures in America sat down like exhausted managers and decided that the best way to survive was to drink coffee and talk things through. Chapter 3: Learning the Calendar. In the quiet years that followed the first gatherings, the new rhythm settled in slowly, like a city learning a changed timetable for its trains. No one announced that the world was different. There were no public decrees, no grand declarations. Life at the bottom looked much the same. Men still stood on corners, restaurants stayed open a little too late, envelopes moved from hand to hand. But at the top, where decisions once came like lightning, something more patient began to shape the days and nights. The commission had become a fact, not of law but of survival. The most dangerous men in the room were now also the most scheduled. The commission did not meet every week. Its members preferred not to be seen together more than necessary. In most months, its work travelled through messages and smaller sit-downs. One boss would send a trusted emissary to another. A suggestion would move from New York to Chicago, from the harbour to the heartland, stopping in back rooms and clubhouses that never appeared in the guidebooks. When tensions rose, phones rang more often, but even then the goal was to keep storms indoors. They learned to plan their gatherings around other noise, using conventions, sporting events and political seasons as cover. It was, in its quiet way, a new sort of calendar. Not everyone adapted with equal grace. Some of the older generation grew restless with all this talking, but they also saw that when the rules were followed, their world became more predictable. A dispute over a numbers route in Brooklyn would no longer slide straight into late-night ambushes. Instead, news of the problem rose up the chain. The bosses weighed whether it was worth their time. If it was, they arranged a sit-down. The subjects would be brought in, their versions heard, and some practical division laid out. Those decisions rarely left anyone thrilled, but the work continued and the streets stayed quieter. The commission was less about fairness than about keeping noise to a minimum. Beyond New York, the influence spread in subtle ways. Chicago, with its own long history of drama, appreciated the logic of a council that could bless national ventures and avoid overlapping claims. Midwestern and East Coast cities watched closely. If the big names could share power without constant public disaster, then local arrangements could copy certain habits. A few regional bosses, eager to show they understood the times, made a display of asking before launching anything that might be mistaken for expansion. The wisest among them learned to treat consultation not as humiliation but as insurance. Those who did not learn risked find themselves gently reminded that the table had a long reach. History outside their world did not pause. The country shifted through depression and then toward war. Attention turned to parades, speeches, and uniforms. In that wider confusion, the commission model showed its strength. While governments reshuffled their priorities and newspapers chased headlines overseas, the council at the top of the life quietly kept its own house in order. It did not stop all conflicts. Grudges could not be erased by a few meetings. But when serious matters rose up, there was now a practiced path. Talk first, count costs, then decide. The simple insistence on steps, on sequence, began to feel natural. For Luciano himself, the price of leadership came early. The same structure that he had helped build could not shield him forever from the slow work of prosecutors and patrolmen who were tired of feeling outplayed. Eventually, pressure and charges pushed him into a different kind of exile. The man who had shaped the board was moved off the main stage, his influence reduced to circuits of messages and loyal intermediaries. It might have broken a smaller idea. The remarkable thing about the commission was that it did not vanish with him. The other bosses had tasted the benefits of scheduled calm. They were not eager to return to the old gamble. The table survived the absence of the man who first arranged the chairs. In this period, Frank Costello found his way into a role that suited him. He was never the loudest or the most feared in legends told on corners, but he understood the language of reassurance. He spoke well with judges, with politicians, with businessmen. He could smooth a worry without leaving fingerprints. Within the circle, his influence was that of the quiet colleague who keeps reminding everyone that consistency is good for profits. When matters arose that might bring noisy trouble, Costello would nudge the discussion toward the safest option that still protected their interests. Bit by bit, he helped polish the commission into something more than a one-time pact. It became a routine. In dim rooms thick with smoke, conversations followed a familiar pattern. A concern would be raised. A family was pushing its luck. A partner overseas wanted a piece of something new. A union problem needed guidance. The men seated or represented would listen, each considering how it touched his own operations. They did not vote in any formal way, but consensus formed. A message would be drafted, an instruction given, a limit set. They were not eliminating danger, they were managing it. The life had always fed on risk, but now it did so with ledgers open and eyes on the shared bottom line. The calendar they built was not on paper, it was a habit of timing. Larger meetings during seasons when travel could be explained, smaller consultations tucked into the corners of legitimate events, regular check-ins disguised as social visits. They learned to space things out, to never create a pattern simple enough for outsiders to trace. Within that careful spacing lay a truth. The leaders of this underworld had accepted that their survival depended on never again making themselves look like a conquering army. They would be a committee that pretended not to exist, keeping its own schedule with the patience of men who planned to live into old age. For all their calculation, they could not escape the slow tightening attention of government. A few detectives and federal agents had listened long enough to rumors and testimony to suspect that leadership was more organized than the official line admitted. Early reports spoke cautiously of councils and joint decisions. There was still much guesswork, mixed with exaggeration and error, but the general direction of those suspicions was not wrong. In calm tones around their own tables, lawmen were beginning to learn the same language: structure, coordination, strategy. It would take time before they could act on it. Meanwhile, the Commission continued to schedule its shadow meetings, confident that vagueness and distance would shield them. In private moments, some of the bosses felt a strange satisfaction at how far they had come. Many had started as restless boys running small errands in crowded tenements. Now they were in effect board members of a hidden network that reached across states. Yet those moments of pride were brief. Most were wise enough to know that the more efficient they became, the more they resembled the very organizations that governments were equipped to study and dismantle. That sense of unease flickered at the edges of their thoughts. For the time being, it only made them more careful. Tomorrow could be handled tomorrow. Tonight, they agreed they would keep the calendar. That is how the middle years of the Commission unfolded, with all their imperfections and quiet accommodations. No parades, no announcements, just a growing habit of consultation that soaked down through their world, like a rule written on walls no one could see. For the listener drifting towards sleep, it is curious to imagine a world where some of the hardest men alive taught themselves to check a mental schedule before starting a fight. Chapter 4: Apalachin and the Picnic That Spoiled the Secret. By the late 1950s, the Commission had been operating long enough to feel almost secure. Meetings were held carefully, scattered in time and space, wrapped inside harmless occasions. Sit-downs took place in quiet rooms, private homes, out-of-the-way clubs. Messages travelled through men whose names never appeared in the papers. The council had managed to be influential without becoming a spectacle. For a while it seemed that discipline and caution might keep it that way. Then came a gathering that felt, at first, like a clever idea. A country retreat, fresh air, a chance to conduct serious business in a place where no one would be watching. The location was Apalachin, a quiet spot in upstate New York, far from the usual city concerns. A comfortable house with a lawn, trees, and enough space for important guests to breathe. On paper, it looked peaceful. A host with standing in the life, grounds where cars could be parked, rooms where conversations could break into smaller circles. The plan, in broad strokes, made sense. If the cities had grown thick with eyes and cautious whispers, perhaps the safest way to hold a larger meeting was in a sleepy area where neighbors minded their own business, and the local police had more experience with traffic stops and complex investigations. Invitations went out in the quiet language of that world, respectful calls, discreet contacts. The names attached to them formed a list impressive enough to make a prosecutor sweat. Bosses and high-ranking men from New York, from other states, from far corners of a network that had grown used to acting as if it were invisible. They arrived in dark suits, better suited to midtown than to country lawns. They came in shiny cars that did not quite fit the gravel roads. The driveway filled, the grounds filled. Somewhere along the way, the gathering shifted from discreet to noticeable. To the people who lived nearby, the sudden parade could not help but stand out. So many polished vehicles, so many men in careful clothes. Not tourists, not a family reunion, not local businessmen. Curiosity began to stir, the quiet kind that shows up at windows and doorways. In addition to the natural attention, there were already lawmen in the region with an eye on certain names. Suspicion had been simmering from other cases and casual sightings. When they saw the traffic heading toward one particular house, suspicion sharpened into focus. Inside the gathering, the mood mixed formality with a strange sort of leisure. Men greeted one another, shook hands, stepped aside to talk in low voices. There were discussions waiting to be had about leadership, territories, and shared interests. There was talk to be done about new opportunities and old disputes. But there were also refreshments, chairs on the lawn, the illusion of a friendly picnic among peers. For a moment, it looked like the commission ideal had found its most relaxed expression. A conference in the country, complete with food. If anyone felt uneasy about the number of notable faces in Nunn Place, that feeling did not rise high enough to stop the show. On the roads outside, state troopers took a closer interest. One patrolman, already aware of certain names, saw more than coincidence in the steady stream of expensive cars and out-of-town plates. Questions were asked, plates were checked, stories did not match. Suspicion turned into investigation. Soon more troopers arrived. The picnic had drawn an audience it had not invited. The quiet gathering of men who prided themselves on planning suddenly found themselves facing that thing their system was designed to avoid: attention. What followed had an edge of unintentional comedy that would have been funny if it had not been so serious for those involved. As troopers approached, men who had built reputations on composure in crisis scattered through fields and woods, scrambling over fences, trying to look like innocent visitors who had taken a wrong turn. Fine shoes found mud, expensive suits brushed against branches. The country air they had chosen as a shield gave them nowhere to hide. Some were stopped on nearby roads and offered explanations that sounded thin. Others were caught walking, as if that might erase the fact that their cars still sat in the yard of a well-known host. Arrests and identifications began to stack up. To authorities who had been fighting for proof of a national structure, this was a gift wrapped in tailored wool. They did not yet have all the charts and recordings they would later assemble, but they now had something nearly as valuable in the short term: names, faces, associations. What had been whispered as rumor could now be shown as evidence that important figures from many places saw value in coming together under one roof. The Apalachin incident did not fully explain the commission, but it shouted that there was more to the underworld than scattered local gangs. Back in the cities, outrage and embarrassment rippled through the circle of leadership. The retreat that was supposed to represent careful organization had instead exposed the dangers of overconfidence. Some blamed the choice of location. Others blamed sloppy arrangements, too many cars, not enough subtlety. A few quietly asked whether the very idea of such a large physical gathering belonged to an earlier, less watched era. It was one thing to accept that they needed meetings. It was another to behave as if no one was studying their movements. Among themselves, they tried to downplay the damage. Stories were circulated to suggest harmless explanations. A birthday, an anniversary, a social visit, anything but a council. Yet, behind the denials, the alarm was real. Law enforcement and the public had seen a rare glimpse of the scale and formality of their connections. The Commission could no longer rely on being dismissed as myth by every official voice. Apalachin had given journalists and investigators fresh language and motivation. Where there had been reluctance to admit to structure, there was now a trail too obvious to ignore. In the months and years that followed, hearings and inquiries started to catch up with the implications. Officials spoke less shyly about organized networks. Investigators began to sketch diagrams on chalkboards, tracking relationships that had been assumed but not often proven. A path led from this man to that man, from this city to that city, and the Apalachin gathering sat there as a stubborn point of reference. The council in the shadows had been spotted, if not fully understood. The bosses, watching this development, measured the cost of a single sunny day in the country. Inside the life, the lesson was not lost. The idea of large, showy meetings lost whatever charm it might have held. The Commission did not dissolve, but it grew more careful and more remote. Smaller sessions, fewer travel patterns, more reliance on messages and trusted go-betweens. Those who favoured caution now had the strongest possible argument. They could point at the grainy photographs and official reports and say, "This is what happens when we make it easy." The irony was sharp. The mechanism designed to prevent uncontrolled crises had almost created done by gathering too neatly in one place. For the listener, the image of that day remains strangely gentle and strange. Well-dressed men, some older, some in their prime, standing under trees and on grass, suddenly aware that they have been seen. Not in a dark alley, not in the middle of a noisy raid, but at what was meant to be a dignified private meeting. The scramble through the woods, the ruined shoes, the frustrated dignity, all of it plays almost like a scene from a calm, dark comedy. Yet for those men, the consequences were real, stretching far beyond the laughter. It was the moment when the secrecy of their collective life began to fray in public. In the end, Apalachin did not destroy the Commission, but it shifted the story. From that point on, the underworld's leaders knew that their habit of meetings would be watched. Law enforcement, newly energized, understood that the path to understanding this world lay not only in tracing single acts, but in mapping how men sat down together. For the Commission, the era of casual confidence was over. From here, every calendar entry, every invitation, every seat at the table would have to be earned twice. Once in their own world, and once against the quiet question of who might be listening. Interlude, the men behind the meetings. Before the long table in the shadows settled into its mature shape, there was a stretch of years when the Commission existed as much in the habits of particular men as in any shared rule. These were the quiet architects, the ones who believed strongly that order, even in a cruel trade, was worth defending. To understand how the meetings held, it helps to imagine not just headlines and indictments, but evenings that never made the news, where tired men with careful manners tried to keep chaos from clawing back in. Picture a private back room in a midtown restaurant. The main dining area is bright and busy with families, couples, and waiters balancing heavy trays. Behind a thin door, the light softens. 3 men sit together, each with a cup in front of him, each with a jacket that hangs a little heavier than it used to. One handles politics, Full understands money like a second language. One commands loyalty on the street. None of them raise their voices. They talk about Apalachin with short, dry remarks, about the country house, the muddy shoes, the wrong lesson drawn from a nice lawn. Then the talk moves on to what can be fixed. Fewer large gatherings, more discipline, a clear message that no one is to treat a meeting like a parade ever again. They are not boasting, they are patching a leak. These men are not naive. They know what they have done to reach this table. They know what happens when rules are broken inside their world. but they also know what happens when there are no rules at all. They have seen younger men prove their courage in ways that left nothing but wreckage. They have watched fortunes vanish because one boss refused to call another before acting. For them, the Commission is not mythology. It is a tool to make sure that the pain they already own does not multiply for nothing. In another life, some of them might have been stern union negotiators or severe accountants. In this wit, they are custodians of a narrow, flawed idea of stability. Walk with one of them as he leaves such a meeting. He steps out into cool night air. The street smells of exhaust and roasted chestnuts. People nearby are laughing about something that has nothing to do with him. A cab slows, then takes him downtown. He watches building lights smear past and thinks about which captains need to be reminded of the new standards. No wild moves without checking, no shouting matches that invite outside attention. He is not wrestling with morality, he is thinking about longevity, how to carry his family, his operation, past the kind of public disaster that had turned Apalachin into a national word. Inside each family there is at least a fide figure like this, someone who has lived long enough to be tired of improvising with lives. They are the ones who insist on sit-downs before fights, who send messages instead of immediate soldiers, who measure every choice against the question, will this bring the kind of heat that gathers commissions and task forces on the other side? The Commission relies on these people more than it relies on any formal agreement. They are the culture carriers, the ones who teach by example that real power does not need to prove itself with noise. Of course, not everyone shares their discipline. There are always younger men with sharp suits and sharper tempers who see caution as weakness. They want to be seen. They want rumors to curve around their names. They grumble when told to wait for an answer from above. They complain in bars that the old-timers have gone soft. To them, the Commission is an invisible brake pedal pressed by men who are afraid to step on the gas. Some of these restless rising stars attend small sit-downs and misunderstand what they are witnessing. They hear talk of avoiding unnecessary harm and think it is fear instead of strategy. Now and then one of these impatient figures pushes too far. Perhaps he orders something he has no right to order, or he leans on someone connected to another family without warning. In earlier decades, such a move might have lit a chain of revenge. Under the Commission habit, it triggers something different. A phone call, then another. A quiet arrangement to meet. The offender is brought in, not to be applauded, but to be educated. His own boss has to sit there, explaining him like a problem employee. There is a cost. Money reassigned, pride dented. In some cases, worse outcomes delivered in calm terms. The lesson is clear, the circle is real, and it expects even hotheads to cool down. The Commission's strength in this era is not magic. It is repetition. The same expectations spoken in different rooms by men who barely like each other, but fear the same disasters. No more headline wars, no more impulsive eliminations of top figures without consent, no more public gatherings that look like crime conventions. The architects of this order make their case in patient language until it sinks in. This is how things are done now. You want to move against someone important, you ask. You want a new racket in a sensitive place, you ask. You do not surprise the people who can hurt you from every direction at once. Beyond their private logic, the city around them keeps changing. Politicians come and go, task forces rise and fade. Yet there is a stubborn belief inside the council culture that, with enough discipline, Conrad Jeevus path required the clatter of the bill. The might finker on the bone beyond their private logic, the city around them keeps changing. Politicians come and go, task forces rise and fade. Yet there is a stubborn belief inside the council culture that, with enough discipline, they can ride every wave, that their habits of caution will always outrun the tools of the other side. A few of the older men are not so sure. They look at the headlines about new surveillance, about federal cooperation, about prosecutors who build cases not on one event but on patterns. They feel something tightening, but the daily work of keeping their world balanced leaves little time for worrying about invisible strategies. They focus on what they can control, which is making sure their own people do not light fires they cannot contain. Sometimes, late at night, one of these architects sits alone at a kitchen table in a respectable house. His family is asleep. A single lamp is on. He turns a glass in his hand and considers the distance between his quiet suburban surroundings and the weight of his decisions. He thinks of the young men who follow his orders, of rivals with whom he now shares careful understandings, of judges and officials he has shaken hands with at charity dinners. He does not regret the commission idea. In his mind it kept things from becoming worse than they already were. But he does sense, dimly, that structure has made them visible in a way that is hard to escape. Organization brings comfort. It also draws lines someone else can trace. For listeners drifting toward rest, these years in the middle of the story can feel almost muted compared to the loud wars and the later trials. Yet they are where the commission truly lived, in these ongoing, unremarkable meetings, in these constant reminders, in these small acts of restraint enforced by men who understood that if they did not govern themselves in some fashion, someone else would do it for them, with handcuffs and headlines. They did not know exactly how soon that reckoning would arrive. They only knew they were trying, in the only way they understood, to keep their dark world from collapsing under its own weight. Chapter 5: The Long Table in the Shadows. After Apalachin, the air around the commission changed. The country house and the running shoes in the mud had been a warning, clear enough for anyone willing to pay attention. The council of bosses did not vanish, but it pulled itself deeper into the shade. Fewer large gatherings, more careful arrangements, smaller groups, quieter rooms. The long table of their world became less a piece of furniture and more an idea trusted only to the most disciplined. They had learned that their strength was also an outline someone else could trace. In public, some officials still hesitated to say that a formal structure existed. Others were now certain and hungry to prove it. Committees were formed, reports written. A few determined men in uniform and in suits began to link Apalachin with old cases and new patterns. The word syndicate, once dismissed as dramatic, sounded less theatrical. At the same time, in the back rooms of New York and other cities, certain bosses acted as if nothing had changed. They did business, they held quiet talks, they reassured themselves that bad day upstate did not define them. Beneath that surface bravado, though, even the most confident had begun to count who might be watching when they sat down. The commission adapted in the way it knew best, by turning attention into another problem to be managed. Meetings were now often folded into occasions that looked ordinary. A dinner at a club that also hosted judges and actors, a visit to a racetrack already crowded with familiar faces, a trip framed as a personal holiday. The same care that had once gone mostly into avoiding rivals now went into avoiding cameras and curious patrolmen. The long table in the shadows learned to move. It could be a corner booth, a side office, 2 chairs in a quiet apartment where visitors came and went alone, never in herds. In this new stage, communication itself became an art. Messages traveled by hand, by word of mouth, by coded remarks tucked inside everyday conversations. No one at that level trusted telephones without reason. A casual call about family or business might carry a second meaning understood only by those familiar with certain phrases and rhythms. The commission no longer needed to assemble everyone to be felt. It existed as a chain of understandings, as a tone in certain voices, as a shared sense that some decisions could not be made without consulting an invisible quorum. Then came a different kind of crack in the silence. A man from within, Joseph Valachi, standing in a courtroom and later in hearings, began to talk in a way that few from his world ever had. He spoke of structures and ranks, of codes and rituals, of an order that sounded very much like the one officials had been trying to describe for years. To the Commission, it was as if someone had taken a dim sketch and started filling in the lines. Even if Apalachin did not know every detail at the top, his words confirmed that there was, at the very least, something real behind the whispers. For the public, and for politicians who had long resisted the idea of a national organized body, this was a spectacle. Headlines embraced the drama. Listeners heard stories of ceremonies and sworn bonds. The notion that there were families, that they answered upward, that there was coordination, spread beyond law enforcement circles. Even if not every claim was precise, the effect was damaging. It made it easier for serious investigators to argue for more tools and more patience. The Commission itself did not give interviews. It responded the only way it could, by becoming quieter still. Inside that upper circle, the reaction carried more weary frustration than panic. The bosses were not shocked that frightened man might talk to save himself. They had always known that risk. What troubled them was how each new description helped their enemies think correctly about structure. The myth of the lone madman at the top had been replaced by a picture much closer to the truth. A board, a council, a system. That was both a compliment and a threat. They behaved accordingly. Caution became a virtue. A boss who once enjoyed holding court with many visitors now preferred one or two trusted faces. Larger affairs were left to social clubs that stayed deliberately vague. Where there had been a taste for visible success, there was now an emphasis on modest surroundings. Cash moved through more hands, through more layers. Real power sat in simple rooms that did not match its reach. For men used to symbols, this adjustment was not always comfortable. But for men who intended to avoid cells, it was necessary. At the same time, they could not ignore the changing world beyond their doors. Governments were learning how to listen at a distance. Wiretaps, microphones, cameras small enough to hide in wood and plaster. The very walls might no longer be trustworthy. Young agents, less impressed by old myths, studied patient surveillance. A meeting that once would have felt perfectly discreet now carried the question of who might have left behind a device the size of a button. The more advanced the tools above ground became, the more the long table had to retreat into simplicity. Faces known since youth, locations chosen for predictability, not convenience. Conversations kept short, with details left unsaid. Still, the Commission fulfilled its purpose. Territorial questions were answered away from headlines. New ventures in gambling, labor, and distribution were discussed and apportioned in calm, almost bureaucratic tones. Older bosses, their hair thinning and their steps slower, appreciated the quiet. They had survived too much to romance another era of open warfare. They treated the council, whichever shape it took in practice, as a kind of insurance for their remaining years and for the families that would outlast them. Distance between cities shrank in practice as arrangements were made. The long table might never fully assemble, but its presence could be felt whenever two underbosses in some side room said, "We should ask before we move." For law enforcement, this era was both frustrating and clarifying. They could feel coordination, see patterns in labor disputes, construction contracts, shipping routes. Cases hinted that decisions in place echoed agreements made in another, yet it was hard to catch the key figures together. The council had learned its lesson after Apalachin. Photographs of many bosses in the same frame became rare. Conversations were interrupted if a stranger seemed too interested. What remained were fragments, tapes of mid-level figures, glimpses of envelopes, ledgers that danced around names. Enough for suspicion, not always enough for sweeping solutions. Not yet. Behind the scenes, some persistent investigators and prosecutors began to talk in cool, careful language about new approaches. If they could not always catch the act itself, perhaps they could treat the structure as the crime. Conspiracy, enterprise, patterns. The same sense of organization that made the Commission effective also made it vulnerable to minds that could think in charts and timelines. In simple offices lit by fluorescent tubes, legal thinkers were, without realizing it, starting to sketch the outline of tools that would one day hit the Commission where it lived. For the men at the top, evenings around that invisible long table had taken on a restrained, almost somber tone. They were not only deciding about territories and percentages anymore, they were deciding how visible they were willing to be. Each choice carried two prices, the cost in their own world and the cost if the state used that choice as evidence. The sharpest among them understood that the board they had built to restrain their own worst instincts would soon have to contend with an enemy that loved documents and recordings as much as they loved quiet cash. Yet even with these tensions, there was a certain calm to those years. Compared to the wild early days, the life had worn the grooves of routine. Men rose, worked, reported, went home. Families depended on an order they might never see or name. Younger soldiers came up under the Commission era and took meetings, protocols, and approval as the natural way of things. They had not known anything else. The Council, for all its secrecy, had become tradition. Traditions are comforting, right up until the day they attract the full attention of those who specialize in breaking them. So the long table remained, half myth, half method, sitting in the shadows of major cities and minor rooms. The bosses who met there, in clusters of 2 or 3, saw themselves as custodians of a system that had carried them from reckless street brawls to disciplined influence. They did not know exactly when the law would catch up. They only knew that until that day came, their best defense was to keep talking quietly, to keep rules in place, and to believe that shadows, if held carefully enough, could not be fully mapped. Chapter 6: Concrete Construction and Conference Calls Without Phones. By the time the 1970s arrived, the Commission era had matured into something both steady and quietly ambitious. The men at the top had long since understood that the brightest opportunities lay not only in back alleys and dim bars, but in the bright daylight of construction sites, shipping yards, and union halls. Concrete, steel, trucking, waste hauling, and the many trades that built and serviced cities all offered the same promise: predictable money wrapped in legitimate contracts. To guide such business, a hidden structure like the Commission was not only useful, it was nearly essential. Large projects required cooperation. Building towers, highways, tunnels, and stadiums meant coordinating suppliers, unions, and schedules. A crew that tried to muscle in alone risked tripping over another family's interests and drawing needless attention. The Commission turned these problems into agenda items. Cities were quietly divided into zones of influence, not only for old-style rackets, but for which group could supply concrete here, which could control carting there, which local could handle a particular union. It was not harmony. It was orderly self-interests. In back rooms that smelled of coffee and tobacco, representatives discussed upcoming projects with the seriousness of executives reviewing a portfolio. There was calm talk about which company would bid, what numbers would be safe, how union leadership should respond. Bribery and pressure lived under those plans, but the planning itself followed a strangely polite rhythm. One voice would say, "This area is ours, we will carry the risk." Another would agree, provided that a neighbouring project down the line went to their people. A balance emerged, shifting over time, maintained by the understanding that chaos was bad for everyone. For the men in the street, orders came down in simple lines. Support this local. Make sure that company gets its trucks through. Encourage that foreman to see things our way. They did not need to see the whole picture. Very few were told that, 2 cities away, another set of men had been given assurances to keep out of a certain project in return for space elsewhere. The Commission existed above them as a kind of weather, deciding where the rain of opportunity would fall. What made this period different was the patience of those watching from the outside. Law enforcement had grown more methodical. Agents and detectives were learning to follow paper instead of just people. They traced who won contracts, which companies appeared again and again despite complaints, how certain unions always seemed to elect leaders with the same quiet friends. They did not always know the names whispered in commission circles, but they could feel the pull of an unseen hand. At the same time, technology had crept closer to the heart of the life. Rooms once considered safe were less trustworthy. Tiny microphones and recorders appeared in places no one would have imagined a decade earlier. Hidden surveillance began to catch pieces of the conversations that stitched the system together. A casual remark in a social club, a complaint from a soldier about sharing money, a careful explanation to a corrupt official, all of it could, in time, be replayed by people with patience and headphones. The Commission did not gather in grand councils to discuss such devices. Instead, warnings filtered through the ranks. Do not speak freely in certain halls. Do not assume a familiar bar is a safe room. Use code, or better yet, say less. In this way, the idea of conference calls without phones took shape. Decisions were passed along like a relay, from one trusted figure to the next, each adding just enough detail for the recipient to act, never so much that any conversation would tell a full story if it were overheard. Still, the coordination remained impressive. A worker might notice that on different sites in different boroughs, the same companies always seemed to be around. A careful observer might see that particular locals never seemed to clash for long before making friendly adjustments. None of that was an accident. Each quiet compromise echoed back to some small conversation in which representatives, speaking for their bosses, agreed that this matter should not be allowed to turn noisy. The Commission had become an unwritten regulatory body for their corner of the economy. For some of the men on the council, this was the proof that their experiment had matured. The days of reckless, noisy feuds at the very top felt distant. Now they could look at maps wondering not who could be pushed out with immediate street action, but how best to divide contract routes so that everyone earned and no one invited, a task force with headlines in its eyes. It was a colder, cleaner way to think. It made them feel, in certain mirror-lit rooms, like tycoons. But the same traits that gave them that sense of elevation also made them easier to track for those willing to do the work. A federal agent with a neat handwriting and a stack of files could begin to see patterns that matched what the bosses privately arranged. When Nent family enforced a no-show job rule on a site and another honored it across town, it suggested communication. When extortion on one pier ended after a quiet meeting miles away, it suggested that a word from above held weight. From these hints, patient minds began building a theory backed not by rumor, but by records. Within the Commission orbit, there were signs of strain. Not everyone agreed on how strictly the rules should be followed. Younger, hungrier figures with less memory of the bad old days wondered why they should always wait for faraway approval. Some could not resist talk that was bolder than their situation deserved. A few liked to boast in coded ways that were not as clever as they sounded, and somewhere, in walls and cars, devices were listening. Clips of speech, stray admissions, became threads that prosecutors would later weave into larger nets. Yet the culture of meetings held, when real disputes flared over labor locals or construction profit, calls went out. Men travelled in ones and twos to calm lounges, back tables, short walks in the open air. They reminded each other that no single score was worth tearing up the arrangement. If a crew got out of hand, its own leaders were expected to correct it. The Commission, mostly unseen, pushed for an order in which serious problems never had to reach its full attention. If something did, the response, though rarely described out loud, could be decisive enough to make the point. In this controlled atmosphere, there were evenings when the bosses let themselves believe they had found a stable formula. They were seated at the junction of crime and commerce, exporting fear downward and importing money upward, while the world around them grew louder with its own concerns. Wars overseas, protests in the streets, political scandals. Against that backdrop, One more union meeting or construction contract did not seem like a priority for the public. That sense of being overshadowed by larger headlines fed their confidence. It was a comforting illusion. Somewhere else in the same country, however, a different kind of long table was at work. Prosecutors and investigators were building cases that treated this underworld not as scattered incidents, but as an ongoing enterprise. They spoke in legal terms about organizations, patterns, and responsibility for actions taken by others. They read transcripts from wiretaps, matched voices to names, names to roles, roles to a structure that looked suspiciously like the commission itself. What the bosses saw as a shield, these officials saw as a map. The conference calls without phones that had once made the commission so elusive were becoming less invisible. A word spoken in one place now had a way of showing up as evidence in another. Slowly, carefully, the legal minds were learning to argue that if you sat at the top of a structure, you could be held to account for what happened beneath it, even if your own hands never signed the order. It was a new way of thinking, and it aimed itself directly at the quiet strength the Commission had spent decades perfecting. In the calm of their familiar haunts, some bosses sensed the shift without yet seeing its full outline. They noticed more surveillance, more grand juries, more talk among lawyers about broad charges instead of narrow ones. They told themselves that they had outlived many storms and could outlast this one too. After all, they still had their rules, their meetings, their discipline. But the truth was that the very success of their ordered world had taught their enemies to look up the ladder. Soon enough, the Commission would discover that its greatest invention, the shared table of power, was also its most exposed point. Chapter 7. Giuliani reads the minutes. The 1970s gave the Commission a feeling of control. From their perspective, the rules had held. Major disputes were settled quietly. Profits from construction, unions, gambling, and other interests flowed with manageable interruptions. The board in the shadows had turned a world of impulsive violence into something that looked, at least from the inside, like management. But in small offices and bland conference rooms, another set of minds was learning to read those patterns. Where the bosses saw a shield, certain prosecutors and investigators saw a paper trail. The calm at the top had left tracks. Among those watching was a group in New York determined to treat the underworld not as scattered stories, but as a single continuing enterprise. They collected files, listened to tapes, read reports, and sketched names across long charts. One of the most visible figures in this wave was Rudolph Giuliani, a federal prosecutor who liked clear lines and big cases. He and his colleagues were less impressed by legends and more interested in how money moved, who authorized what, and how the same small set of names kept appearing around unions, construction contracts, and sit-downs that never appeared on any public schedule. Up to that point, many big cases had focused on individual acts, one unaliving here, one extortion there, a shipment, a payoff. The legal system had been trying to shout down a choir by addressing one voice at a time. Now, guided by tools created earlier but not fully used, prosecutors leaned into a different approach: treat the structure as the crime. The racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's law, once sitting on the shelf like a dense manual, found readers who understood its potential. If they could show a pattern of activity directed by a continuing group, they could pull top figures into the same case, even if those leaders rarely touched the work with their own hands. To build something that ambitious required patience. Investigators tuned into clubhouses, cafes, and homes. Wires were tucked inside walls and under tables. Cars were bugged. Phones were tapped under court orders. They listened to men complain, boast, argue, and negotiate. Much of it was mundane, talk of family, sports, weather, meals. But hidden in the flow were acknowledgments of rank, references to the commission, mentions of needing approval from above, careful comments on how disputes had been or would be settled. On corkboards and legal pads, these bits were arranged like pieces of a quiet puzzle. Here a boss approved a union contract, there an underboss mentioned needing to check with other families, somewhere else a captain referred to what the commission would or would not permit. None of these alone was dramatic. Taken together, they pointed in a clear direction. The law had always suspected a table at the top. Now it had fragments of minutes, spoken without knowing they would one day be read into transcripts. While these recordings accumulated, the bosses went on with their routines, confident that caution was enough. They met in smaller groups, spoke in vague language, and believed they had outrun most dangers by avoiding another Apalachin-style spectacle. Some heard that the government was using sophisticated listening devices and shrugged. They had survived so much already. They had rules, they had intermediaries. Most of all, they believed in their own experience. It was hard for men who had outlasted many enemies to imagine that a stack of charts could threaten what bullets had failed to shake. Yet the charts grew. Giuliani and other prosecutors worked with teams that spent long days matching phone calls to meetings, meetings to decisions, decisions to money. Wiretap transcripts were reviewed and annotated. Guardians of evidence drew lines that traced influence from street-level actions to the men who sat in quiet rooms and signed off on strategy. What had once been a cloud of rumor around the commission was turning into something that, in a courtroom, could be called proof. Each new connection drew another thread through the invisible board of directors. As the early 1980s deepened, the pressure built slowly, almost politely. Grand juries were convened. Witnesses were called to answer questions about unions and bids and social clubs. Some refused. Some stumbled. Some decided that their loyalty had limits, especially when facing long years behind bars. Their testimonies were rarely clean or complete, but they lined up in suggestive ways with the intercepted conversations. You could see, in the dry language of reports, the outline of the commission culture, consultation, shared enforcement, a habit of approval that reached across family boundaries. Inside the underworld there were signs that not everyone was ignoring the danger. A few cautious voices urged even tighter discipline, fewer meetings, more distance. Others scoffed. They pointed out that the law had been talking for years without landing a blow that shattered the upper circle. Some of them mistook survival for invincibility. They did not see that the rhythm had changed. The law was no longer chasing one story at a time. It was writing a single long story with many chapters and planning to read it aloud to a jury. Meanwhile, the commission continued to fulfill its role, approving leadership changes, managing disputes, and overseeing the delicate balance of income streams. These tasks did not feel like crimes to the men who performed them. They felt like responsibilities, like the necessary work of keeping things from spinning apart. That sense of duty, in their own terms, made them careless in Nan's specific way. They spoke of decisions as if their authority were unquestioned. On tape, that authority sounded clear. To prosecutors, those calm references were not just conversations, they were admissions. By the time Giuliani and his colleagues were ready, they had something rare, a case that aimed not only at individual bosses, but at the commission as a concept. They believed they could walk into court and show that the men at the top functioned as an organized body that guided multiple families in New York, especially in key labor and construction rackets. It would not rely on one dramatic moment, it would rely on accumulation, on the steady patience with which they had listened to men who assumed that their habits of speech were harmless. Some bosses heard rumors of a major case forming and dismissed it as political theater. Others felt a chill that they did not share out loud. When news of impending charges began to firm up, when whispers spoke of a single indictment tying together several heads of families, the reality became harder to ignore. The commission, born decades earlier as a way to limit reckless acts and prevent dramatic wars, was about to face a different sort of confrontation. Not with rivals across the river, but with professionals who had spent years reading and rereading the unintentional minutes of their meetings. The stage was quietly set, files boxed and labelled, transcripts flagged, witnesses lined up, a theory of the case polished in careful language. The men in charge of this effort did not see themselves as striking at legends. They saw themselves as accountants of harm, presenting to a jury an argument that if you sit in the high chair, even in a hidden boardroom, you are responsible for the acts that flow from your design. For the Commission, which had long believed that meetings were their protection, the next chapter would show that sometimes a calendar is also a trail. Interlude 2, The Listeners at the Walls. By the time the Commission reached its later years, there was another set of meetings unfolding in far less dramatic rooms. No private chefs, no linen tablecloths, no thick cigar smoke curling under chandeliers, just fluorescent light, coffee in cardboard cups, and walls lined with steel cabinets. If the bosses had perfected the art of quiet conferences, the people on the other side had begun to perfect the art of listening to them. This interlude belongs to those listeners, the patient minds that turned scattered whispers into the case that would eventually put the Commission itself on trial. Imagine a cramped office in a federal building. A large city map is pinned to a board, dotted with coloured pins. Plastic folders lie open on a table, each with typed reports and handwritten notes. 3 or 4 people sit together, not glamorous agents out of a story, but focused workers with tired eyes. One reads from a transcript, another matches names to recordings, a third updates a chart that now spans several years. They are looking for confirmation of something they already suspect, that certain figures act not as isolated villains, but as part of a guiding council. They do not get there through dramatic revelations. They get there through thousands of small, careful readings. In another room, a technician runs tape back and forth. Voices crack it. Restaurant noise hums in the background. A man complains about a labour dispute. Another mentions needing to check with people above him before agreeing. A third laughs softly and says that nothing big happens without certain elders blessing it. The words are coded, cautious, often dull. To an impatient ear they sound like nothing. To a trained listener they are pieces of a language. Captains who defer upward. Disputes resolved after calls between families. Mentions of meetings that never appear on any official schedule. The technician marks the timestamps, then passes them on to analysts who speak this quiet dialect. These listeners are not mystics. They are translators of habit. Over time, they notice that when one boss is recorded hinting at a plan, another boss in a different borough seems already prepared for it. They see that a threat made in one city aligns with a sudden correction in another. None of it is enough alone. Together, it suggests a coordination that matches what informants only ever describe in fragments. The Commission, which for decades relied on being denied by officials as fiction, now finds its outlines sketched by people who have never set foot in its rooms. On that table lies a stack of reports from cooperating witnesses. Some are old soldiers who decided that age and risk outweighed loyalty. Some are middlemen caught with too much to explain. Their stories are messy, self-serving, occasionally contradictory, but the listeners treat them like overlapping maps, where one description matches another. Especially when backed by recordings or surveillance, the picture sharpens. A mention of a regular gathering at a certain club, a habit of calling specific numbers before resolving a dispute, a pattern of respecting unwritten boundaries across family lines. The witnesses may not use the word commission. The analysts write it in the margin. Elsewhere, agents step out of unmarked cars to watch social clubs at dusk. They see who goes in, who comes out, how often certain cars appear. They note that leaders do not travel in big group anymore. 2 here, 1 there. It looks like caution. It is caution. But the very repetition of such movements, tracked over years, becomes data. When the same small circle of faces appears at the edges of multiple disputes, multiple contracts, multiple unions, the conclusion grows harder to ignore. There is an organizing layer here, even if it refuses to show itself in none frame. The listeners also learn from their own early mistakes. At first, some believe they can catch everything on tape, that devices tucked into walls will produce full speeches about councils. Instead, they get partial phrases, clipped references, mundane filler. They adjust. They stop expecting confessions. They look for acknowledgement, a nod in words that certain men speak with authority, a deference that lesser figures show without being prompted. The commission is not discovered through dramatic statements. It is confirmed through tone, through who asks and who answers, through who never seems surprised when decisions come down. In any meeting, a young prosecutor stands before a whiteboard cluttered with names. Older investigators sit listening. The prosecutor traces lines between bosses of different families, pointing to events that seem at first unrelated. A union intimidation here, a bid fixed there, a territorial dispute cooled down faster than anyone expected. The argument is simple. These outcomes suggest prior coordination. The law they intend to use allows them to treat such coordination as evidence of a single enterprise. They are, without naming it in grand tones, laying out how to put the commission itself into the center of a case. Some in that room are skeptical. They remember earlier eras when talk of national councils was considered exaggeration, but the new material is difficult to dismiss. Tapes of careful conversations, records of synchronized pressure on key businesses, testimony about rules against unapproved attacks on bosses. The prosecutor does not ask them to trust in myth, he asks them to trust in patterns. When the meeting ends, there is no applause, just a list of further work. More transcripts to review, more witnesses to question. The case that will one day be known by its nickname is, at this point, only a stack of tasks or several desks. This interlude also has its quiet human side. Among the listeners and case builders are people who have lived in the same neighborhoods as some of the men they investigate. They know the social clubs from the outside. They have heard older relatives speak in reverent or fearful tones about certain names. To switch from that loose mythology to the measured labor of building a case requires its own discipline. They cannot rely on stories told in kitchens. They have to ground every line in something that will withstand cross-examination. They drink their late-night coffee and remind each other that suspicion is not proof. Proof is work. At the same time, the underworld is not idle. Some bosses grow more cautious with every year. They limit their words, vary their routes, retire certain meeting spots the moment they sense too many new faces nearby. They follow their own brand of counter-surveillance, taught by bitter lessons. But the listeners on the other side also improve. They coordinate across agencies. They share information that used to sit in separate files. They make sure that what team hears in Brooklyn can be matched to what another sees in Manhattan. The invisible board above the families is, without knowing it, being mapped by another board that sits beneath fluorescent tubes and shares information far more easily. In this slow contest, time favors patience. The commission model depends on the belief that if Noah speaks too directly, Noah can never tie the threads together. The law's new approach depends on the belief that if you collect enough threads, indirect language will still weave into a shape a jury can recognize. The listeners are not trying to catch the perfect sentence. They are building a story in which hundreds of imperfect sentences point the same way. When they finally move, it will be with the confidence that they can show not isolated crimes, but a continuing leadership structure. For you, as a late-night listener, there is something almost soothing about this mirrored discipline. On one side, aging men who rule their dark corners by insisting on meetings, on calm tones, or rules against reckless spectacle. On the other side, steady professionals who answer that order with order of their own, listening, charting, filing, preparing. 2 layers of administration moving toward collision. When the Commission finally finds itself on trial as an entity, it is not ambushed. It is met by people who have studied its habits so closely that they can stand in a courtroom and, in plain language, explain how a secret board tried to manage crime like a business. The listeners at the walls, the technicians with headphones, the analysts with charts, are rarely remembered by name, but their work is the reason the legend of the Commission shifted from rumour to documented fact. They brought patient attention to a world that had relied on whispers and myth to stay safe. In doing so, they changed the balance. After them, no large council in the shadows could ever again assume it was too careful to be seen. Chapter 8. The Commission on Trial. When the indictments finally landed in the mid-1980s, they arrived with the weight of all that careful preparation. Names that had rarely appeared together in official documents were suddenly bound within the same thick pages. The government laid out a case, claiming that certain bosses and high-ranking figures had, through their roles on the Commission, directed a web of crimes tied to labour racketeering, construction, and more. It was not an accusation of impulsive acts done in dark alleys. It was an accusation of steady guidance, like a board charting the course of a company. For the accused, many of them older men who had grown used to surviving headlines, there was a familiar set of routines. Lawyers hired, statements denying the existence of any such commission, public images of frailty, of distance from daily affairs. Yet beneath the outward composure, this case felt different. It stitched together years of surveillance, informant testimony, and the government's evolving understanding of how the underworld actually worked. The courtroom would not be a stage for a single sensational story, but for the argument that meetings themselves, when tied to criminal acts, could be part of the crime. The trial unfolded in a federal courtroom that looked, at first glance, like any other. Wood benches, flags, a high bench for the judge. But the cast sitting at the defense tables carried decades of whispered reputation. Anthony Salerno, described by the government as a leading figure of the Genovese family. Leaders and representatives of other key families. Men long suspected of sitting at the top of the commission now sat within easy view of reporters, jurors, and curious citizens. The secrecy that had cloaked their gatherings did not apply here. In this room, everyone watched. The prosecutors approached their task with a methodical calm that mirrored, in an inverted way, the Commission's own style. They put on witnesses to explain how unions had been bent, how bids had been influenced, how payments had moved. They laid out charts that showed overlapping spheres of influence. They played recordings where voices, sometimes gentle, sometimes rough, spoke of approvals, shares, and rules. It was not dramatic in the sense of sudden confessions. It was more like watching a slow structure emerge, beam by beam, from an empty frame. Much of the testimony came from men lower in rank, people who had seen or heard enough to describe pieces of the machine. Some were cooperators seeking leniency. Others were experts explaining the implications of coded phrases. Defense attorneys attacked their credibility, pointing out inconsistencies and motives. The cross-examinations were determined and often sharp, yet each attempt to break a witness had to contend with the broader pattern. Even when Nen's voice shook, the documents and tapes and other voices still pointed in the same direction. One of the trial's quiet powers came from its refusal to chase sensational detail. Instead, the government treated the accused as administrators. They showed how regular conversations about contracts, locals, and disputes reflected a shared understanding that the Commission held authority. Statements about needing to check with higher-ups, about decisions made in consultation, about boundaries respected across family lines, all fed the idea that this was not random coincidence, but organized control. For a jury unused to the myths of old newsreels, the comparison to a corporate board was easy to grasp. From the defense tables, the view must have felt strange. Men who had spent their lives avoiding cameras now had no choice but to sit still under constant observation. They listened as their lives were translated into charts with arrows. They watched as their friendships, alliances, and routines were described as the workings of a criminal enterprise. There were moments of irritation, of quiet disbelief that conversations in clubhouses and on sidewalks were being dissected syllable by syllable by people who had never lived their life. But there were also moments of sober recognition that this was the price of years spent believing that caution alone could outpace persistence. Outside the courthouse, the story reached the public in measured headlines. This was not a show built on lurid single acts, but a case about structure and power. The phrase commission, once denied or doubted, now appeared widely, attached to evidence and testimony. Citizens who had long heard rumors about a council of bosses now saw sketches of that council pinned to bulletin boards during news broadcasts. The aura of myth dimmed. In its place stood something more ordinary and, in a way, more unsettling. The idea that a handful of men could, through meetings and quiet decisions, shape entire corners of public life for years. As the trial progressed, the defense tried to narrow responsibility. They argued that their clients were retired, uninvolved, or misrepresented. They said the government was stitching together unrelated events, punishing reputations instead of proven acts. They portrayed the supposed commission as a fantasy, inflated by ambitious prosecutors. But the tapes were stubborn. In them, voices did not sound retired. They sounded informed. They issued guidance, weighed options, and spoke with the relaxed certainty of men who believed their words carried weight beyond the room. Eventually, the case moved to its conclusion. The jury had listened to months of steady detail, a demanding task. They were asked to decide whether the pattern was real, whether the men before them were part of an ongoing enterprise that used their influence to direct crimes. When the verdicts came, they landed like slow, heavy doors closing. Guilty on key counts for several leading figures. Long sentences imposed. For the commission experiment, this was not a skirmish at the edges, it was a strike at the center. In the quiet that followed, those who had crafted the case spoke about accountability, about the power of the law to reach those who preferred to stand behind others. For them, the outcome showed that patience and structure could answer patience and structure. They had treated meetings as evidence. They had treated leadership as responsibility, not legend. Their satisfaction was calm, almost forensic. Years of listening and charting had led to a judgment that echoed far beyond the men in that courtroom. Inside the underworld, the response was more complicated. Some saw the trial as proof that their enemies had finally learned how to think like they did. Others argued that mistakes had been made, that certain figures had appeared too often, spoken too freely, trusted too many settings. Younger members took a sterner lesson. Appearing at the center of anything was now more dangerous than ever. The message that drifted through surviving families was clear. The commission could no longer behave like a fixed council of well-known faces. Permanence had become a liability. Yet for all the fear and adjustment, there was also a kind of grim respect. The commission was conceived as a way to replace chaos with meetings. Decades later, it found itself measured and condemned through the records of those same meetings. The idea that conversation could keep people safe had collided with a system that could treat conversation as a map. It was a quiet irony, one not lost on any thoughtful survivor. What began as a shield against impulsive unaliving and public war had ended at drawing a neat outline for prosecutors who preferred structure to myth. As the convicted men were led away, the era that had started with the end of the boss of all bosses myth entered a new phase. The commission, as it had been known, could not continue in the same confident shape. Too many of its secrets had been spoken aloud under oath. Too many of its fundamentals had been explained to anyone willing to read court transcripts. The board in the shadows had met an opposing board, one with jurors instead of capos, and on that field, discretion alone was not enough. Chapter 9: Empty Chairs and New Voices. The verdicts from the commission trial did not remove the idea that had guided the underworld for decades, but they did rearrange the furniture. Chairs that once belonged to men spoken of in low tones now stood symbolically empty, or were filled by figures who had grown up in the long shadow of the old board. Some of the new names had ambition, some had caution, and some had the neither here nor there look of people promoted, because there was no one else left who fit the suit. In the late 1980s and into the 90s, the life entered a quieter, more self-conscious phase. The upper world had learned the word commission and attached it to transcripts and broadcasts. Those who still met in back rooms understood they were dealing with a legend that would not fade. Families who had lost long-standing leaders faced the practical problem that never makes the news. Someone still had to make decisions, approve actions, keep certain deals alive, while avoiding the mistakes that had just put their predecessors behind bars. In some cases, successors tried to rule strongly, as if nothing had changed. In others, power was spread more thinly, as if even the thought of a central figure was now unlucky. What united them was a shared awareness that to stand too clearly at the top of anything was to invite a file with your name on the spine. The old romance of being widely known inside that world dimmed. Surviving bosses, and those who aspired to be, now spoke more earnestly about staying off radar, as if obscurity had become a luxury brand. The commission itself, as a formal and obvious circle, drew back into fog. There were still conversations between families, still understandings that some matters needed broader approval, but the idea of consistent, recognizable membership was no longer safe. Instead of a stable panel, there were more shifting combinations. This boss met that boss, these two consulted with a third. Decisions were made in shorter chains, designed so that if one link cracked under surveillance or pressure, it would not immediately reveal the whole pattern. The habit of coordination endured, but it wore looser clothes. The echoes of the commission remained, without the comfort of a clearly drawn table. Law enforcement pressure did not vanish after the major trials. It changed temperature. There were more informants, more cooperating witnesses, more phones monitored and rooms tested. The example of the commission case had taught prosecutors that it was possible to move against leadership as a group, and that patient storytelling in court could persuade a jury. In response, some new voices in the life pushed for smaller footprints, fewer social clubs, less predictable hangouts, more legitimate businesses to blend into. They favored day-to-end conversations, almost allergic to the idea of anything that could be mistaken for a conference. At the same time, a different world was growing around them. New kinds of crime and new groups emerged, some with looser structures, some with different traditions, some with no interest in imitating the old council model. International markets stretched across oceans in ways that did not automatically run through the five families. Drugs, once a point of tension and debate among older bosses, drew in actors who did not necessarily care about commission-style permission. The old guard found themselves facing competitors who did not always recognize their careful rules. A system designed to manage its own members had less leverage over those raised outside its custom. Inside the remaining families, thoughtful figures tried to adapt without surrendering everything their predecessors believed had kept them alive. There were still unwritten expectations. Do not create open wars, do not draw the kind of attention that leads to combined federal forces, handle grievances through sit-downs whenever possible. But these principles were now applied with a sharper sense of risk. A meeting might happen in a moving car, on a walk away from microphones, in a quiet corner of a modest restaurant that did not match the old film image of smoky clubs. The goal was the same as it had always been: resolve things before they became disasters. The method had to match a world where every light could hold a camera. The younger generation heard mixed lessons. They were told stories of the old commission years, when leaders could speak with a certain confidence that others would honor shared boundaries. They were also told, with equal emphasis, about the trials that followed when those habits left fingerprints. Some absorbed the caution. They preferred to keep operations smaller, tougher to map. Others heard only half the message and tried to shape themselves into new legends, not fully appreciating that the stage they stepped onto was wired differently now. For every careful planner, there was always someone who believed he could be the exception. Still, if you looked at the way conflicts were handled, you could see the lingering spirit of the commission model. When disputes arose inside a city or between regions, there was usually an attempt to talk first. Calls were made, trusted intermediaries stepped in. The language of sit-downs and approvals did not disappear. It only lost its attachment to a defined, advertised council. The idea that no one family should recklessly endanger all the others remained strong, especially among people old enough to remember headlines and courtroom sketches with familiar faces in the frame. They had no interest in starring in a sequel. Beyond the immediate circle, public opinion about the underworld also shifted. Films and books continued to build their own myths, sometimes close to reality, sometimes not. The word commission floated through scripts and late-night conversations, becoming part of the general vocabulary. Ordinary people might not recall all the names or dates, but they understood that, once, there had been something like a board of bosses. For those still involved, this lingering myth had two sides. It kept a certain aura alive, which could be useful for influence, but it also meant that any hint of a formal meeting could be seen as proof that the ghost of that board still existed. Respect and risk now travelled in the same sentence. In the quieter rooms, the surviving elders sometimes spoke softly about what had been won and what had been lost. They remembered a time when the absence of structure had meant endless surprises, each more dangerous than the last. The Commission had brought a crude sort of order, a code of consultation that limited the damage. Then it had brought, indirectly, a new kind of prosecution that saw in that order not discipline, but design. The younger men listening to these reflections could hear the caution, but not always the context. Their world was one where cameras watched doors, where digital records of money existed, where messages travelled faster and left traces on screens. The commission that their mentors described felt like a story from a slower century. And yet, under different names and softer forms, the instinct to confer remained. Men with overlapping interests still found it wiser to sit together than to launch chaos. Agreements were still made about territories of influence, about which families had say in which industries, about how to respond when none of their own was taken by law enforcement. These arrangements were more temporary, more flexible, but the logic behind them was familiar. You cannot operate in crowded cities forever without rules. Someone will always suggest a meeting. Someone will always insist that big decisions cannot be left to impulse. For those listening from a safe distance, drifting towards sleep in another time, the picture that emerges from these years is less dramatic than the tales of early wars and bold councils. It is a portrait of an underworld adjusting to the knowledge that it is fully seen, even when specific acts are hidden. The empty chairs of imprisoned bosses remain symbolic at the edges of memory. The voices that replace them speak more softly, argue more about risk, and weigh every contact as if a microphone might be resting nearby. The Commission, as a fixed institution, may have bent, but the human habit it represented, the urge to gather and negotiate instead of ignite, lingered in many of these new, quiet rooms. In that sense, the age of empty chairs and new voices is a long twilight for the old idea. It is neither pure downfall nor clear continuation. It is a cautious glide, as that generation after another tries to take what worked from the council model without inheriting the full cost. Some succeed, keeping things small and subtle. Some do not, and discover that the system built to catch boards and enterprises has not grown any kinder with time. But the core lesson, for those wise enough to see it, is simple. Once you have taught the world to think of you as an organization, you must live with the fact that it will never again see you as scattered shadows. Chapter 10. Ghost Meetings. In the present day, the Commission exists as a story told at different volumes in different places. In court transcripts and history books, it is an established fact, charted with names and timelines. In old neighbourhoods, it is a memory half wrapped in nostalgia, half in relief. Among those who still move in the darker corners of city life, it is a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power becomes too neatly organised for its own safety. The original table may be gone, but its shadow still stretches quietly across how people think about organised crime. Sit for a moment in the back of a small restaurant where nothing much seems to happen. It is late, the last regular customers have gone, and two men remain at a corner table. They speak in low voices about business that, on paper, could be entirely legitimate. A contract here, a partner there, someone who needs reminding to keep an agreement. The words are plain. They avoid old terms that reporters have learned to recognize. There is no bold mention of councils or votes, yet the shape of the conversation is familiar. They're consulting, weighing the effect of actions on a wider circle, measuring risk beyond themselves. In the calm rhythm of their talk lives a faint echo of the Commission way. Modern law enforcement, shaped by decades of cases and informants, does not dismiss such echoes. It assumes structure wherever it sees coordination. Surveillance has grown subtle, digital trails are followed, messages between phones and accounts are mapped. The kind of meetings that once took place in well-known social clubs now must dodge cameras set high on street corners, records kept by reservation apps, identifiers embedded in keycards and license plates. To gather a room full of recognizable faces is no longer simply unwise, it borders on reckless fantasy. Those who understand the stakes prefer not to be part of any photograph that could be shown in a courtroom. As a result, the underworld has scattered itself into smaller, looser clusters. There are still people who claim authority, still invisible lines about who handles what. But the vision of a single American board deciding national policy feels like something from a different century. Too many cases, too many leaks, too much technology have made that level of formal unity both dangerous and unnecessary. Cooperation happens, but it looks more like overlapping circles than a single central wheel. Some of those circles barely trust each other. Some trust no one outside their immediate crew. And yet the idea of the Commission lingers not just as memory, but as a kind of ghost rulebook. In many places, those who have been around long enough still say in their own plain words that chaos is bad business. They warn younger, eager men not to start pointless wars, not to harm the wrong people, not to pull everyone into the light for the sake of war's insult. They might not call a council to decide each matter, but they build habits of coordination on a smaller scale. A phone call to another city before making a move, a discreet conversation to cool down a dispute, a mutual agreement that certain lines remain uncrossed. These are fragments of the old discipline, surviving because they make sense, not because someone wrote them into a constitution. In law offices and task force rooms, the legend serves another purpose. When new investigators are trained, they are taught the history of the Commission. They see how long it took for authorities to understand that structure mattered as much as individual acts. They study the major trials that proved leaders could be held responsible for guiding an enterprise over many years. That history becomes a lens through which they view modern patterns. If a small group seems to share sources, methods, and profits, suspicions rise that somewhere, seen or unseen, there might still be a habit of meetings. The ghost of the old council helps them ask better questions. For the public, the Commission has drifted into the gentle haze reserved for stories that are at once dark and oddly orderly. It is easier to think of a council of calm, calculating men than of scattered, unstable harm. In a strange way, the idea of a meeting at the top offers a kind of comfort. It suggests that even in criminal worlds there are rules, procedures, minutes in some invisible ledger. Those who know better understand that the reality has always been less tidy than the myth, but they also recognize that, for a time, the Commission was a genuine attempt to replace chaos with administration. That experiment, with all its consequences, reshaped both crime and the response to it. If one imagines a ghost meeting now, it would likely be a small and careful one. Perhaps 3 men in a quiet back room, no fanfare, no crowd in the hallway. One is older, carrying history in the set of his shoulders. One is middle-aged, fluent in both the old slang and modern codes. One is younger, restless in a way he tries to hide. They talk about trouble on a certain corner, about law enforcement heat on a certain route, about a proposal that could bring in more money but touch too many nerves. The older man says that anything which risks bringing all eyes on them is not worth it. The middle agrees, translating the warning into practical terms. The youngest listens and nods. If he is wise, he understands this is not cowardice. It is the last living line of the Commission's central lesson. If you can solve a problem with words, do not invite a disaster with action. Outside that imagined room, the world moves quickly. Digital payments hum, cameras blink red and green, messages cross oceans in a heartbeat. The idea of a grand fixed council of crime leaders feels like a relic. But the tension between chaos and order inside such worlds has not disappeared. Somewhere, someone will always prefer a sit-down to a street war. Somewhere, someone will argue that they need rules, even bad ones, to prevent worse outcomes. And somewhere across a table, another person will insist that rules are chains, that fear alone should decide. The Commission story lives in that argument, in every generation that has to choose which side it trusts. For those trying to rest while hearing this tale, there is a curious calm in looking back at it all. At first, there was a world of proud men who believed in single rulers and sudden moves. Then came a group who decided that, for everyone's survival, there should be meetings and votes, boundaries and approvals. They built a hidden board of directors for their world, and for a while it worked in the narrow sense they intended. It reduced open war. It made certain streets a little less volatile. It turned fury into agenda items. Then the very order they created allowed patient outsiders to see them clearly, to write laws that fit their shape, to put them on trial as an organizing. The Commission as a concrete institution rose, functioned and faltered. What remains is its imprint. Law enforcement that now looks for patterns, not just for faces. Criminal groups that know large, obvious counsels are invitations to long sentences. A lingering habit, in many corners, of talking before acting. At its core, the story is about people who lived by harsh choices yet taught themselves, reluctantly, to sit down and count the cost together. Their reasons were far from noble. Their impact on others was often cruel. But the mechanism they built, the simple act of replacing some portion of impulsive harm with structured debate, changed the way both sides of the law understood power. So the ghost meetings continue, more in the mind than in any location. They appear whenever someone asks what it means to run a dangerous enterprise without destroying it. They appear in legal arguments about responsibility at the top. They appear in late-night talks where veterans warn newcomers not to repeat mistakes carved into history. And they appear here, in this quiet retelling, where the volume is turned low and the rough edges are blunted enough to let you drift. In the end, what remains of the Commission is an uneasy wisdom that in any world built on fear and profit, the choice to sit, to speak softly, to think past the next morning, may be the only thing standing between a dark routine and complete ruin. That does not redeem the story, but it shapes it. In the long view, the Commission is not only a legend of men in suits, it is a reminder that even in the worst corners of human behavior, someone eventually realizes that the most radical act is to call a meeting, listen, and walk away with everyone still alive.